So as I think is normal with these things, we'll wait for a few moments for the participants to slowly be let in, and we'll start our session probably in a couple of minutes from now. But welcome everyone who is joining. Well, maybe we should get moving, because we have got quite a lot to get through. Welcome everyone. My name is David Archer. I'm the head of programs and influencing in ActionAid's global secretariat. Welcome to this session, which is about the gendered impact of austerity policies on education. One of the reasons why I'm saying a few words at the opening of this is that last year, I was asked to play the lead role as the convener of the finance track for a Heads of State Summit at the UN General Assembly, the Transforming Education Summit. And at that summit, I think probably for the first time ever in an international meeting on education, we managed to shift the dialogue around education financing from the very conventional focus being on aid or on loans and on international mobilization resources, and really shifted the focus both in the background discussion paper and in a finance call to action that came out of that summit to domestic financing, and the which makes up, if you add up all of the aid and all of the loans to education, it adds up to only about 3% of the global financing for education. 97% of financing for education comes from domestic sources. So for the first time, this international meeting did focus on that 97%, rather than thinking that the solutions would come through mobilizing more aid or more concessional loans. And when you start looking at that domestic financing for education, some things become very clear very quickly. We have to pay attention to the share of national budgets that are spent on education, and we've often got big reference points for that countries should be spending about 20% of their national budgets on education. But often countries are spending 20% of their national budgets on education and still don't have enough money to provide universal, good quality public education. And the reason for that is usually that the 20% is a 20% share of a very small pie. And the bigger question then is, if we're serious about expanding financing for education, how to expand the size of the pie. One of the most, I think, important pieces of work about how would you finance education and other sustainable development goals was done by the IMF Fiscal Affairs Department, which actually said, if you're serious about financing the SDGs, you need to look at the tax to GDP ratios and help low-income countries expand tax to GDP ratios. Most countries could expand by 5 percentage points. So if the average tax to GDP ratio for low-income countries is about 16%, you rise to 21%. That would enable most countries to double their spending on education and double their spending on health and significantly increase spending on social protection. So if we're serious about wanting to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and education in particular, there are pathways to mobilizing substantial financing in a sustainable form through action on tax. Unfortunately, despite that being part of the IMF's global analysis of how you would support the financing of education and other development goals, in practice, the IMF dialogue with ministries of finance almost always defaults to a dialogue about austerity. Rather than talking about expanding tax revenues in order to be increasing public spending, the default, as we have shown again and again, is to recommend cuts to public spending, and particularly cuts to or freezes to the public sector wage bill. This is profoundly significant for education, because if a government is told to squeeze the amount of money it spends on the public sector wage bill, the largest single group on the public sector wage bill are teachers. And that's pretty much in every country. Second largest group are health workers. And if you can't expand spending on teachers, it's actually almost impossible to expand spending on education, because teacher salaries make up the vast bulk of spending on education. So what we managed to do in this Transforming Education Summit with heads of state was to shift the dialogue and say, anybody who's serious about transforming the financing of education needs to be serious about pushing back against the policies of austerity and looking at alternatives through progressive action on tax in order to expand revenues and to make the investments that are necessary. There's been a lot of work that has been done on the gendered impact of austerity, and that's very much the focal point of this discussion today, that when government budgets are squeezed, there's at least a triple disadvantage on women. The first disadvantage is that women and girls are the first to lose access to public services, and particularly to education. So if the government budget is squeezed and more resources go into supporting private school and fee charging, if the government budget is squeezed and fees rise, girls are the first to be excluded from school, because when you have to pay to go to school, families tend to choose to send boys rather than girls. So austerity has a direct impact on girls not being able to access education when fees are used as an alternative to public budgets. The second big disadvantage, gender disadvantage from the austerity cuts to public spending, would be on access to decent work. Women make up the vast majority of frontline teachers and also nurses and other public sector workers. 70% of primary school teachers worldwide are women, and actually, particularly in rural communities, access to decent to being a teacher or working in some other form of public service, some of the best opportunities for decent work for women. And because women in frontline roles as teachers are often on the most vulnerable contracts, when public budgets are squeezed and there are redundancies, women tend to be impacted first. But the third and really dramatic impact, gendered impact of austerity, is on, when public services fail, what happens is that women end up assuming a disproportionate share of the burden of unpaid care and domestic work that rises when public services fail. So whether it's about caring for children at home when they're not able to go to school, and we saw a lot of that obviously during COVID, the burden tends to fall on women. Women end up being the shock absorbers for austerity policies. Now, we have a panel today which will look at these issues in great detail. I think we have got, for the first time, the idea that austerity and challenging austerity should be at the centerpiece of our discussions around education was established at this Transforming Education Summit. And that is something that we can build on over this coming period. So I think it's very appropriate that this session at the CSW is really building on that momentum and bringing together a wide range of actors who have been working on this in different ways. We're going to hear, first of all, today from Farida Shahid, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to education. We'll be hearing also from colleague Rose Salbrink, who's been leading a lot of our work on the financing of education and the impact of austerity. We'll hear from Aurea Morzino from the Global Alliance of Tax Justice, who's been leading the work on tax and gender and making tax work for women and building feminist frameworks for tax. We'll hear from Evelyn from the Tax Justice Network in Africa about some of the work that has been done, particularly, I think, in driving policy change around tax and the fact that Africa Union Ministers of Finance played a transformative role last year in getting a vote at the UN General Assembly to shift the locus of tax policy making away from the OECD Club of Rich Nations towards the UN. really a transformative moment and very significant for enabling us to push back against austerity and the impact on women. We'll also be hearing from Liz Nelson from the Tax Justice Network around global tax abuse and some of the main culprits. And finally, we'll hear from Maria Rambalcera, who is the coordinator of the Tax and Education Alliance, which is a body that brings together all sorts of different actors, from ActionAid to the Global Alliance Tax Justice Network, Education International, the Federation of Teacher Unions, and the Global Campaign for Education. And that bringing together of different actors to offer an alternative to austerity and to show that there are ways of financing good quality public education everywhere, and that we don't have to submit to what is effectively a cult of austerity. Now, I've had to, unfortunately, will have to leave early, so Maria from the TaxAid Alliance will facilitate the flow of this session moving forward. But I'm going to first of all hand over to Farida Shahid, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to education, a role that's played such an important contributing role to the understanding of the right to education over the years. So over to you, Farida. And thanks very much.
Thank you, David. And thank you, everyone, for organizing this discussion around a very important topic. The financing of education is something I hope to take up is as part of my mandate. However, I am not a finance expert, so I will not be speaking so much in the technical aspects of this, really looking at this from the human right to education perspective. And I think before we start talking about the gendered impact of austerity, just to remind us where we stand today and the kinds of issues it will impact. So on the positive side, you have more than 2/3 of the countries in the world have managed to get gender parity in enrollment at the primary level. But many countries in Africa, Middle East, South Asia have not. And for example, for every 100 boys who are enrolled in primary school in Chad and Pakistan, respectively, only 78 and 84 girls are enrolled. We have 5.5 million more girls out of school than boys in the world. Also of concern is that the global progress in reducing primary level out of school children has stagnated since 2007 for both girls and boys. This is long before COVID and the impact subsequently. Gender inequality in education, of course, impacts the social well-being of the family at the very immediate personal level. And more broadly, of course, when you have gender disparities in education, this leads to the underutilization of human resources and potential, which negatively impacts any ability to have sustainable development over the long run. And of course, the barriers to girls' access vary across regions. However, they are very strongly linked to poverty, to geographic remoteness, to armed conflict, to the lack of school infrastructure and poor quality education. And of course, you have then the patriarchal norms that put a lower value on girls' education. And I think David was referring to some of that, and the disadvantages, therefore, especially for marginalized girls who are not sent to school, taken out early, etc. So worldwide, it seems that families bear at least 17% of the educational costs, even when it's supposedly free. There are costs, and reducing such costs have really shown an increase of access of children. And this includes like abolishing school fees, cash transfer programs, and food in schools. Also for marginalized girls, you have reducing the distance to traverse to and from school, getting bathrooms set up separately for girls, very simple things, gender-sensitive teaching approaches, and flexible policies that allow girls who have dropped out to come back to school, especially young mothers. All of these have helped the access. And there's also documented evidence that girls' continued studies beyond the primary reduces child early age marriage. And child early age marriage per se negatively impacts the health, not just of the mother, but of the offsprings, and also then perpetuates the cycle of poverty in which people find themselves. And so too often when confronting economic crisis, and that's where we are today, people use non-healthy options to cope with it. And one of the non-healthy options is not to send girls back to school, as we saw in COVID, and to get them married off very early as possible. And the fear is that austerity measures will put all such special measures at risk of closure or not starting. So we're not learning from the lessons. And the most marginalized will suffer the most. This will deepen and widen the education gender gap. And I want to stress that the right to education, meaning lifelong learning opportunities, is a fundamental human right. And it's an empowering right that opens access to many other rights and is therefore absolutely crucial for girls, women, other gender minorities, and other marginalized groups. And to ensure this right for all, it means that we have to acknowledge and address the mounting challenges of today. This includes climate crisis, which is severe enough to threaten our very existence, forced displacements, health disasters, armed conflicts. Now, all of these challenges were recognized by the Transforming Education Summit. And ensuring this right is the primary duty of states. And as David said, they must first mobilize their domestic resources. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights demands that states take steps to maximize the available resources so as to progressively achieve the full realization of economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as through international assistance and cooperation. As said, the first obligation is on the states. And through the Incheon Declaration, many states have committed to increasing their public spending on education and have urged adherence to international regional benchmarks, which is 4 to 6% of GDP, or at least 15 to 20% of total public expenditure for education. And for this, as David also has already said, the tax systems must be reoriented, and we must bear in mind the principle of fiscal justice to ensure the redistribution significantly reaches the most marginalized. And it's vital to improve the efficiency of education spending and to target resources towards the most marginalized, which is especially girls, persons living with disabilities, refugees, stateless populations, and forcibly displaced learners. However, as you said, we are witnessing austerity measures and drives, in part driven by and catalyzed by COVID-19. And such measures open the door to the privatization, commercialization of education, which negatively impacts the most marginalized, as repeatedly decried by the special rapporteurs on the right to education. Now, achieving the SDG 4 by 2030 demands serious reconsideration of the state of education, including the financing of education. The TESS call to action recognizes that education is greatly underfunded and that crises dramatically impact the long-term investment required to transform educational systems and ensure their resilience. Now, many countries have experienced slow economic recovery, rising debt costs, and domestic reprioritization during and following COVID-19. Systemic issues in education, nationally and globally, mean that groups of children and youth, including but not limited to refugees and internally displaced, are missing out on the benefits of education and falling further and further behind. The impact of all of this is inevitably worse on girls. The call for action on financing, of course, urges all countries and partners to take concrete action nationally as well as internationally to invest more equitably and more efficiently in education. Now, the overseas development assistance has been actually stagnant since 2020, and bilateral funding has fallen by more than $350 million. And major states, bilaterals, have also undertaken significant cuts. A word of caution. So David said that the amount of money is maybe 3% worldwide, but the influence of that 3% is much more important. And I think it's something that we need to consider when the proportion is so small. The policies are then made accordingly, and this undue influence needs serious consideration. Of concern also is that in parallel, international financial institutions have been pushing for austerity measures, as we just heard, including the number, as David said, of public sector employees. And as he said, this would specifically impact teachers and health service providers who account for the bulk. There's also a push to disinvest in public sector education in favor of private sector initiatives. Others will speak to this more broadly, more in detail, and I look forward to learning from all of you. But I do want to stress, while there is understandable frustration with the poor delivery of public sector education, there is no historical evidence anywhere that any country has managed to educate its people through the private sector. This has all been done through the public sector. And also many of the private sector initiatives lack transparency. So if we think the government is not transparent, the private sector also has those issues. A couple of other quick points regarding the gendered impact of COVID and austerity. The pandemic exacerbated a pre-existing, long-standing shortage of teachers, especially in certain subjects and some geographical locations. During COVID, we also found 20% of teachers were more likely to feel isolated, 40% showed more signs of depression, nearly twice as many had anxiety. Many teachers, many of them women, in the private sector lost their jobs. Private sector small schools did not have the capital to start again. So when you have the persistent low issues of low salaries and funding deficits, these have intensified, and inflation combined with austerity will mean a moratorium on salary increases. And as David said, if you don't have teachers, you don't have education. And this is another area of great concern for me, that where we need to provide the teachers much more support. Some 60 to 70% of teachers are women. And this will, as David also said, reduce women's job opportunities. But in addition to what he was saying, it's just not that. When you have, in many areas, it is one of the few professions which is culturally accepted as being safe and acceptable for women to enter, and that is a danger. Austerity measures combined with financial downturns will force, of course, all households to tighten their belts. Most likely result is that families will take girls out of school if they can't afford the cost of transport, books, uniforms, etc. And it's likely that the further resources into supporting lifelong learning for teachers will end or become even more poor. In parallel, just to have one last point, is that the pandemic seems to have pushed a narrative of digital learning as the solution to education with less costs. However, this ignores the huge digital gap, especially in lower and middle income countries, where unlike the parity achieved in developed countries, 15% fewer women and girls were connected in 2020. And of concern is that the gender gap that was steadily reducing since 2017 from a high of 25, in 2021 actually grows to 16%. So it's the first time that you have a negative trend. And this, in sub-Saharan Africa, the digital gender gap is 37%. In South Asia, it's 41%. So to conclude, I really do believe that education is the greatest tool that we have to build peaceful, healthy, and sustainable futures for all, leaving no one and no place behind, as promised in the Agenda 2030. And Tess has also highlighted that the potential of education is not just about learning, it's also about learning to live together and human rights. And this demands that we strengthen our human rights education and ensure a human rights-based approach to planning education and delivery that is inclusive of all and appropriate for all genders and identities. And so finally, I just want to say, let's remember that without people, that is without girls and women, human rights will not be human. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Farida, for these powerful words. Really, really important to highlight the aspect of education as being a right, not a commodity, not a privilege, and the impact, the negative impact and the threats that austerity and privatization poses. So I'm going to pass over the word now to my colleague, Rose Salbring from ActionAid. Over to you, Rose.
Thank you very much, Maria, Farida, and David for setting out already so many important points. I will be focusing on the gendered impacts of austerity policies more broadly, but looking with some examples on education. This is based on research that ActionAid has done over the past years, together with Education International and Public Services International. And there are many reports and more details and case studies that I won't be able to talk about today. Colleagues already touched on how austerity policies turn women into involuntary shock absorbers and de facto care providers. So how do public sector wage bill cuts in particular undermine education and gender equality? Colleagues have already mentioned the multiple crises and the economic policy responses that we have seen to these crises on top of already 40 years of public budget shrinking have led to cuts in public sector workforce. As Farida already mentioned, before the COVID pandemic, there were high shortages of teachers. And this lack of public budget is really undermining government's ability and also their obligation to deliver quality public services. As many know, focusing on women's rights and gender equality, public services play a very important role in achieving women's rights. So these cuts are really reinforcing intersecting gender inequalities, and the cost of these crises is therefore being passed on to those who are least able to pay. As Farida already mentioned, this impacts the most marginalized the hardest. Crises in general impact women, non-binary and marginalized groups in the Global South the hardest, including through an enormous subsidy of unpaid care and domestic work, which has only increased during the pandemic, but also increases with a lack of public services. So unsurprisingly, we are seeing a stark regression of gender equality and women's rights, going back by almost a decade since the pandemic. So whether some of these policies are imposed by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, or from ministries of finance, the imposition of public sector wage bill constraints impact public services the most, as David already mentioned. And often these are pushed to bring down budget deficits and to pay back debt. This is the argument. It's not necessarily what's the outcome. So, for example, in the Global South, the fiscal space has been constrained already before COVID through longstanding debt. And this has come to a head since COVID, but also with rising food and energy prices. So a study from Eurodad found that between 2010 and 2020, public debt rose from an average of 40% to 62% of GDP. And in 2020, so just at the start of the pandemic, funding allocated to pay for external public debt was larger than the expenditure on education in at least 36 countries and larger than healthcare in 62 countries. This is likely only increased with the amount of debt distress we're seeing, including defaults of governments on their public debt, such as Sri Lanka and Zambia and Chad. So there are two direct consequences to public sector wage bill cut. As David already pointed out, it blocks the recruitment of new teachers, nurses and essential workers, even when there are already severe shortages. These are not taken into consideration by ministries of finance and economists. And it imposes strict limits of already very low pay in existing education, health and other public sector workers, and really undermines the recruitment, but also the retention of qualified staff. And this severely impacts the public education sector, as was already pointed out. ActionAid's 2021 report, Public versus Austerity, published together with Education International and Public Services International, exposed how the IMF advised austerity cuts between 2016 and 2021, so just over 4 years, in just 15 countries, mainly low and middle income countries, have blocked the recruitment of the equivalent of 3 million teachers, nurses, and other essential public sector workers. This could have made a huge difference in pandemic response, but also in reaching SDG 4 and others. In just those 15 countries, the IMF recommended cuts added up to nearly $10 billion US. So we're talking about huge amounts here. that are very important for funding public services. So this is clearly undermining education and health outcomes, especially in the global south, with very restrained fiscal space and also more payment on debt. So since then, we've seen that the IMF has also published its gender strategy, which is aiming to mainstream gender across its work. However, it's not considering its own policies, how its own policies impact gender equality and its own role within that, which is really problematic. But that is a conversation for another time. So considering the public sector wage bill freezes, there are also other public austerity policies. So we're talking about a mix of public budget cuts, as already mentioned, and pension and social security reforms, regressive consumption tax increases, along with lowering progressive taxes. Colleagues will talk about this in more detail, but also labor reforms, also known as flexibilizations, which are in essence reductions in labor rights, including the right to unionize and collectively bargain for decent work and fair wages. And we know the important role that unions play in ensuring all of those labor rights, and especially also for from a gender equality perspective. Policies also mean reducing and eliminating subsidies. So Farida mentioned some things that can be done to include to increase or reduce the gender gap in schools by providing food or cash transfers, etc., to reduce that 70% that households on average are paying to get kids to school. So when these subsidies are reduced, this also has an impact on the overall household budgets, especially of lower income households. And then there is also the privatization of public assets, which again, with the aim of decreasing public deficit and debts. So this is a whole package of austerity policies that all have intertwining effects. I'll focus a bit more specifically on public sector wage bill cuts, but keep in mind that it's a wider picture of privatization and shrinking of the public budget, and the public sector is severely undermined by these. So why are women shock absorbers of austerity policies? As David already mentioned, women disproportionately lose access to public services. They lose access to opportunities for decent work, but they also take on the rising burden of unpaid care work and domestic work, leading to time poverty. This is also referred to as the triple disadvantage. So women lose disproportionately access to these services because cuts in wages and restricted staff numbers often require changes in how services are provided, what services are provided, and who is eligible to use them. This is particularly of impact of refugees and internally displaced people and people with more difficulty in accessing in general, for example, because of a geographical location. But ultimately, cuts also reduce the availability, the accessibility, and the quality of public services. They exacerbate the barriers that women face in accessing quality public services, and they make often cuts are made directly to the services that primarily benefit women and that are key to women's rights and gender equality, such as childcare, pre-primary education, sexual and reproductive health and rights, and maternal health. Women are often the first to lose their jobs, as they are more likely to work on short-term, precarious contract in frontline roles in the public services. Women are also more likely to work in the public sector than men. And for example, UNESCO stated that 94% of pre-primary education teachers are women, and that the highest proportion of women teachers are concentrated in earlier years of schooling, and that the higher the education level, the lower the percentage of women working there. In Nepal, for example, there is a need to employ 67,000 permanent teachers to meet government plans and education goals, while there are 40,000 teachers on temporary contracts. And our review of IMF documents found that the Nepal government has been under pressure to cut and freeze the public sector wage bill, whilst this reality of enormous shortages and need to meet education goals. And the majority of low-paid contract teachers are women in Nepal, mirroring the overall trend where women are paid 30% less than men. this means that women are shouldering these public sector wage bill cuts and constraints. And also, these constraints compound the gender wage gap that already exists and wider economic inequality that plays out across women's lives, including in relation to pension contributions and economic insecurity in later life. So the commitment to expanding early education in Nepal has been undermined by the fact that the workforce depends on women working on poverty wages. As I mentioned, women are a larger share of these early education than men. So there is an ongoing struggle to improve this in Nepal, but it's very restricted by these wage bill constraints that are decisions made at Ministry of Finance level. And expanding into the public, expanding into new areas of education is difficult when these salaries are being squeezed. And it also works in hand in increased privatization of education, what we're already seeing in Nepal with advice being given of private services within education system. So Education International collected a testimony from teachers in Nepal, and Tulsi Nupane said, I'm an English teacher and a headmaster at Lalit Bikas Basic School. I'm a member of the Nepal Teachers Association. Our salaries have remained stagnant for the last 4 years. After COVID, I met with many public school teachers who did not receive salaries or lost their jobs. I think it is a loss to the education system that so many experienced teachers may now never return, and in their place, we have to recruit unexperienced and untrained teachers. So this shows the different levels of how this perpetuates. Also, we have found that across most countries that the study was done, public education salaries are far below basic levels of breadbasket, food poverty basket, and income baskets. Sorry, Maria, you asked me to add some additional examples for Education International. So
we are running really behind the time, so I don't know, Rose, whether you could just like very quickly wrap up. That would be really useful. Thank you.
Okay,
Sorry.
I thought you wanted me to add a few examples for Antonia, so I thought I would have a few extra minutes to do that, but I will wrap it up then. No problem at all. I'm happy to share more examples later on if there is time. Just to end on unpaid care work, women take up this disproportionate pressure of unpaid care work, and when cuts are made to public services, the need for care does not disappear. Before the pandemic, 76% of unpaid care work on average globally was already done by women. This has only increased. And this injustice is doubled and tripled in cases of women who experience multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination because of their class, race, sexual orientation, disability, age, or migrant status, along other dimensions. And as Farida already mentioned, patriarchal gender norms really govern women's autonomy and bodies from the household to the economy, shaping and reinforcing these relational inequalities on social reproduction and the sexual division of labor. So just to wrap up then, as you can see, it is unpaid care work that compensates for the failure of public delivery, and it's the compounded impact of austerity that really impacts women's rights and gender equality, and unpaid care work that fills in the gaps of state provisioning and states' obligation to fulfill social and economic rights. And austerity and the reduction of public services is, as we're seeing, facilitating a regression of women's rights to the detriment of women's earning capacity, education, health, and leisure time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rose. I'm sorry to cut you short. We are not doing great in terms of time, but it is brilliant, really good presentation as well, showing the gender impact really of austerity as women and girls being the shock absorbers, and then really decreasing the rights, right, to enjoy education and other rights. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Aurea Monsigno from Global Alliance for Tax Justice. Aurea, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I think against the backdrop that Rose and Farida outlined, the narrative that prevails is that there are no funds to put into education, to put into public services more broadly. And I think from the tax justice perspective, I come here and many of us are here struggling to show that there is indeed alternative, and it's just that countries and governments and even the multilateral institutions and frameworks are not take into consideration the policy alternatives that are necessary and needed to actually sustain this commitments to public services and to education more broadly. To say that comprehensive and progressive taxation, which I'll talk more in a little bit, and of which wealth taxes is one of the critical elements, is one of the most reliable, fair, accountable, and sustainable ways of raising finances to make the commitments to address the intersection of women's rights and where they need to be in terms of the investment in education. And these are multiple levels of influence. At a national level, there are many missed opportunities that countries are not taking into their hands into making sure that tax revenues are raised in a sustainable way. And we can see that from the fact that over the last while, it's about 2/3 of countries that do not have sufficient forms of wealth taxations to then raise the revenues, to put revenues into public coffers. And this is data from the latest survival of the fiscal report from Oxfam that says 2/3 of countries do not have any form of inherent tax on wealth and assets that are passed on from wealth holders to the next generation. And other opportunities are also missed at the international level, where we have an inadequate international system that does not respond to the current challenges of how economies are organized, particularly with the digitalized service provision and digitalized profits, and how that happens in that realm. And also the system that is highly unfair towards developing countries in the sense that they continue to lose their tax rights by the prevailing arrangements, and even in some of the solutions that are being put on the table. And I think Evelyn will talk a little bit more about the OECD two-pillar solutions versus the UN proposal that has made great advances towards the end of last year. But this is to say that if we look at that international tax system and how much is actually missed in squandered resources that are not taxes, it's taxed. Tax Justice Network estimated that in 2021, it was in the order of 483 billion a year. So what we are seeing is that we have forfeited possibilities of raising public revenues from untaxed wealth. And this, of course, has gender implications, particularly if we look at the intersection between women's rights and gender in public services. Every dollar that is not taxed, particularly every dollar that is coming from untaxed wealth, it's a missed opportunity for governments to invest in critically underfunded public services like education that are not just good in its own right, but also to address the unequal distribution of unpaid and underpaid care work and domestic work that is largely and disproportionately realized by women. So let me talk a little bit more about these alternatives in bringing in our proposals for what feminist taxation or feminist frameworks for tax are. At the very basic level, when we talk about a feminist framing for tax, we're saying that we need to have tax systems, tax policies that eliminate implicit and explicit gender and discrimination bias against women in tax policies. Where we see now explicit discrimination against women in tax policies actually reduced. It's not very prevalent. But in the way they are designed, tax systems tend to, in a way today, harm women in the sense that they tend to, with the overall reliance on consumption taxes, for example, that tend to have a higher incidence on lower incomes and the feminization of poverty, we see that it's women that tend to bear the brunt of these highly regressive tax systems. So the approach for framing and feminist framing of tax is really starting by saying that a tax system that is predicated on progressive, redistributed, and gender equitable tax measures will go a long way in actually ensuring that we have not only the resources raised, but also spent in ways that can promote women's rights and gender equality. I want to talk a little bit about how these resources are spent, because I think this is where the connection with public services and education comes in very handy. I come from a part of the world, there's a lot of mistrust around taxation because because people have an understanding that our governments are inadequate in spending those resources, they squandered them. I think there's large truth to it, but I think there's also an importance of pushing an alternative narrative of where those funds should go. And I think from GACHA, Allies in the Tax Gender Working Group, which encompasses many organizations that are working at the intersection of economic justice and women's rights, developing the 5 R's framework for care really helped us understand how we could then direct those public resources coming from progressive taxes to ensure that rights are protected, are defended, and are advanced. And those 5 R's include essentially ensuring that resources raised from tax are used to in building public services. And I want to underscore the public here, that recognize, reduce, redistribute, and critically reclaim the public nature of public services, pushing against privatization, which is something that Farida was talking about, and particularly underscoring the workers' rights. It's important that the services remunerate adequately domestic and care workers across the world. I'm going to now wrap up because we have about many other interventions, but I want to talk to you very quickly about the poster that's just behind me, which is on why we put together this campaign on wealth taxes. Bearing everything that I've just said about the connection between women's rights and progressive taxation and public services with particular focus on education, we put this campaign recognizing that at this juncture where we have raised inequality, we have governments increasingly facing a narrative at least of constrained resources because of their external debt obligations. We need to push forward as a women's movement, as economic justice movement, at the tax justice movement. We need to push forward in reclaiming concrete policy asks that governments can take immediately to ensure that these are not, again, our dreams deferred to future opportunities. And wealth taxes are really the critical missing points that we are facing right now, with wealth scaling absurdly during the pandemic, and still we're having more countries reducing the not only the rates but also the extent to which they actually tax wealth. So it is important in this campaign we are saying, we are calling on governments to ensure that they adopt a full range of wealth taxation measures to raise resources to address the critical needs that women have, not only that were enhanced during the pandemic, but they are there because of patriarchal gender norms, and also how economic systems are created in a way that disadvantage women and puts the burden of care towards them, while at the same time it keeps undermining public services that are essential not only to diminish gender inequality, but also to uphold social well-being for everyone. Critically, we are calling on corporations to cease their practices of tax avoidance and tax evasion, which is very prevalent, and calling on multinational institutions to actually create the policy space for governments to do that at the international level, by pushing forward and accepting even more meaningful discussions around the UN tax convention that would ensure that countries in the global south then can negotiate their taxing rights in a way that is adequate with the economic activity that happens in their jurisdictions. Maria, I don't want to go too long, but I just want to say that Gache and with our allies, we are running this campaign until the end of next week, where we're going to have a number of events that talk about the connection between tax justice and women's justice and gender justice and women's rights. And I want to invite everyone to continue following the campaign as they're also following the CSW negotiations and discussions. We're going to put some links on the chat so people can know what events they can attend. But critically, remember that we do have the alternatives. They exist, they're not a dream, they are political choices. The lack of funding for education and the impact this has on women and girls is a political choice that is being made, and we have the tools available to actually push against these political choices that don't represent the interests of women and girls and of teachers and of peoples across the world, particularly in the global South. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aurea, for reminding us that, this rising inequality, this gender inequality is not a mistake, it is by design, and just that there are alternatives, there are realistic, actionable alternatives, and that the money is there. So thank you very much for bringing up these feminist taxation alternatives. So without much further ado, I would like to invite Evelyn Muendo from Tax Justice Network Africa to present. Evelyn, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, once again for this invitation. I had prepared a PowerPoint presentation, but for the sake of time, I think I'll just have to speak orally. I hope that's fine. Okay, thank you. So I'll be covering the importance of the global financial architecture towards tax justice, as well as towards gender equity and justice and women's rights. As has been mentioned by previous speakers, domestic resource mobilization is very critical to education financing. It's actually taxes that actually finance education as compared to other sources of financing, such as official development aid and such as official development aid, so ODA. And for that reason, can I just share my PowerPoint, please?
Go for it, please.
Okay, thank you. Let me go ahead and share it. It's right here. I've realized how important it is. For that reason, yes, as I was saying, for that reason, domestic resource mobilization is quite important towards financing for education. And I know this is a quote from David Archer, which I always like to use, that DRM is the answer towards financing for education, and we're actually going to need trillions and not billions. And this is in reference to the fact that it was estimated that in order to achieve SDG 4 between 2015 and 2030, we'd require $39 billion in low and middle income countries. However, we call for a much higher threshold than that. Also, domestic resource mobilization and tax justice particularly is quite important towards achieving gender equity, as well as also upholding women's rights. And I know the previous speakers have really talked about how regressive tax systems are particularly harmful towards women, and that in a lot of cases, we find that women are the ones who are bearing a greater tax burden than men, especially within regressive tax systems. And this is because of the biases of the tax policies. Another big issue that we still have to talk about to this day, especially within the context of African countries, is the absolute lack of gender disaggregated data, which makes it quite difficult for tax administrations, and not just tax administrations, but for the larger government to carry out quantitative analysis on the impact of tax policies on gender. So the complete lack of collection of gender disaggregated data is really harming the strides that we're making towards gender equity. And then lastly, women are bearing a greater tax burden, and at the same time, there's very little investment into sectors that affect them. So this is particularly with regard to health, education, as well as social protection. And there are very few African countries that are actually implementing gender responsive budgeting to its full. So that was just the introduction, but allow me to talk about now the global tax architecture, the global financial architecture, and why it's particularly important for both gender as well as financing for education. So as you can see, this is a nice map of Africa, and it illustrates that African countries are the efforts towards domestic resource mobilization are being particularly affected by illicit financial flows. So this was a report that was done this was a report from UNCTAD from back in 2020, which shows that Africa is losing 88.4 billion US dollars through capital flight. And what is coming through Africa is 48 billion US dollars through official development assistance and 54 billion through foreign direct investment. So comparatively, we're losing much more than what is coming in because of illicit financial flows. And I know that Tax Justice Network is here. The biggest perpetrators of this illicit financial flows are actually OECD countries, developed countries, who are using the global financial system that they set up in order to forward their own interests and to take advantage and reduce their tax liabilities and propagate aggressive tax avoidance as much as possible. And yet, funny enough, they're the ones who are setting the rules for the global tax system. So that brings me to the next slide. So between 2015 and 2016, it was noted that there was a lot of revenue leakages that was happening because of the way that the global tax system was set up at that time, and that there was a need for countries to come together and overhaul that system, address the challenges and loopholes that had been observed within that system. And so what happened is the inclusive framework on base erosion and profit shifting was established. And this was opened up to not only OECD countries, but to also other countries to take part in, so that they could formulate new international tax rules that would address the revenue leakages that were being caused by illicit financial flows, particularly illicit financial flows that were caused by commercial activities. And so you'll find that what happened incidentally, and I know this has happened, this was happening even before 2015 and 2016, is that we've created the big players within the global tax architecture. And so allow me to discuss the political economy within 3 seconds. You'll find that we have 4 main players. We have the UN through the United Nations Tax Committee, and we also have the FACTI panel. And then within the OECD, we have the inclusive framework, which is made up of 137 jurisdictions, and the Global Forum on Transparency, which is made up of 165 jurisdictions. We also have the US, that exists in its own category and have been particularly pushing for international tax rules that will suit them with regard to digital taxation. And then finally, we have these groupings of nations such as the G7, the G20, and the G77 that have really been giving a lot of political legitimacy to all these processes in varying quantities, so to speak. And so the source of political legitimacy for the inclusive framework on base erosion and profit shifting has been rich countries. So the G7, the OECD countries, and the G20. And there's been very little representation of African countries in these processes. And you'll find that when you compare the value or the weight of the responsibilities and the mandate of, for instance, the UN bodies versus the OECD bodies, the UN bodies have had the role of simply coming up with recommendations, while the OECD bodies have been setting standards and rules that all countries have to abide by one way or the other. So for instance, the inclusive framework was tasked with transforming international tax rules, while the Global Forum on Transparency was tasked with setting standards on global tax and financial transparency. So there's quite a disparity in the level of powers of the UN versus the OECD bodies. So why did we think that a UN tax convention or a UN tax body was important? Three main reasons. The first one being political legitimacy, the second one being the technical benefits, and the third one being the inclusivity and real participation that would afford African countries as well as other developing countries. So for instance, when you look at the participation of African countries in the inclusive framework, it's only been 27 out of 54 African countries that are members of the inclusive framework. And their participation has been quite inhibited by, number one, the lack of or the limited financial resources to fully participate in the meetings that have been taking place in Paris, in France, where these discussions on the tax rules and the decisions that were made under BEPS took place. There's also been limited capacity or limited technical capacity amongst small countries and African countries. And you'll find that the real technical capacity has been in line with the OECD Committee of Fiscal Affairs. And they're the ones who've been pretty much setting the agenda and pushing for that agenda. And even when African countries did bring in technical capacity, even when they did want to express their reservations, there was quite a lot of intimidation that let's move towards consensus. We will deal with all these other issues. We just need a deal for now. Let's move towards consensus. So that's why many African countries are holding back, despite knowing that these rules were not suitable for them. And then the fact that in order to be part of the inclusive framework, there was a minimum standards. There were 4 minimum standards that African countries had to abide by, which they did not set since they were not there. And also there's been very little coalition. There weren't any proper coalitions between countries within the inclusive framework, as we had observed. In terms of the technical benefits, within the global tax deal that was led by the OECD as well as the G7, we'll find that there are very minimal technical benefits that African countries are to get from the deal as it is, and also developing countries as a large. So for instance, African countries and even the AU quite verbally said that they would prefer that the global minimum tax be at a 20% rate. However, in the end, they ended up setting it at a lower rate of 15%. There've been quite a lot of studies that have been done, one of them being by the South Center, which tries to show the revenue impact if they had set the global minimum tax rate at 20% versus if they had set it at 15%. And the revenue impact, the revenue gains for African countries at 15% are quite minimal. I mean, in many African countries, the effective tax rate is much higher than 15%. So for instance, in Senegal, it's at 28.6%. So they're going to gain very little from the global minimum tax rate as it is. The fact that within the deal that they had come up with, essentially, they had taken away rights, the taxing rights of African countries. So they had made the right to collect any top-up tax from the imposition of the global minimum tax going to the countries where multinational enterprises will be headquartered. And we all know for a fact there are very few headquarters, if any, in African countries of multinational enterprises. So essentially, they had done away years of work where African countries had been fighting for source taxing rights and had instead awarded them to developed countries. So that was highly, highly problematic. I know there are new rules which have tried to address this, but even then, it was problematic that they had put it there in the first place. And so African technical inputs were provided in good faith, and I'm just showing a few of the groups that really tried to follow that. However, in the end, the final deal did not really address any of the concerns that we had. And the fight for a UN tax convention had begun way back in 2001. This is not a recent fight. Just to make it clear, there had been people calling for a UN tax body for a long time, and many of those efforts were thwarted, or, they were placated. For instance, increasing the number of meetings that the UN Tax Committee would have instead of giving the UN Tax Committee real power. And so I discussed very briefly why we need a UN tax convention and a UN tax body. Those three main reasons, as well as this, but I won't get into it too much. Essentially, civil society organizations have been calling for a UN tax body, for a UN tax convention for a very long time. And finally, in December, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution giving the UN powers to finally set up a forum for increased and more inclusive, for a more inclusive forum for setting up global tax rules. And my last remark will be to really urge civil societies who are working for the improvement of education financing and also for gender equity and justice that the UN Tax Convention does translate into that. It will affect that and it will feed into it, because finally we'll get a forum where we can take part quite substantively in setting up the tax rules, the global tax rules, instead of letting pretty much the rule breakers become the ones who are the rule takers. And I know that we normally talk about the need to do away with the IMF and such international financial institutions. And my call is that it's bigger than that. We need to do away with letting pretty much such institutions, including the OECD, be the ones to set up the rules that are quite harmful to African countries, whether it's through austerity measures or through unfair global tax rules. That's all. Thank you, Maria.
That's great. Thank you very much, Evelyn. Really, really good remarks, and just like opening our eyes, right, of how much money really is leaving Africa in comparison to how much money is receiving in terms of ODA or even foreign direct investment. Not that we know very often that it is quite harmful. Even that, again, just showing the power dynamics between the OECD, right, like just setting rules that really benefits them with their inclusive framework, right, inclusive always in between inverted commas, and then this really positive move towards the UN tax resolution. So thank you very much. Now I'm going to pass the word to Liz Nelson from Tax Justice Network. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. I'm just going to share my screen. So, and thank you for inviting me. Both Evelyn and Aurea gave such interesting and kind of comprehensive issues that some of them overlapping with some of my comments. So I'll do my best to actually edit as I'm going along. And excuse me, because I've got a bit of a sore throat. So that's another good reason for me to talk less. But I hope also that I can kind of emphasize some of the really key points that Evelyn made, some great slides around the political economy, which I might ask for at some point. Anyway, I'm just going to share a few slides with you, and do feel free, Maria, to stop me if I'm going over.
Thank you. Whilst you are sharing the slides, I would like to remind people that they can put their questions in the Q&A, because we'll have very little time for Q&A. So I'm hoping that once they are written there, either people can reply in writing, or we can allow a few minutes at the end to respond to some of them. So please do write them. Thank you. Over to you, Liz.
Okay, so so I was going to try and talk a little bit about the scale, which something again Aurea and both Evelyn have talked about, but some of the research we've done around the estimates, the conservative estimates of tax abuse at an international level. But we've also done some illustrative studies around tax and education at a regional level with a small group of countries, which I'm going to share some of those pieces with you as illustrations, and then just kind of go over some of the policy solutions that are kind of so critical around the international architecture, but also in terms of the architecture that we have at a national level. So kind of first of all, I just wanted to just mention, Ori had talked about the 5 R's, and I've got 4 R's, and some of them kind of overlap somewhat. But I think the key point I wanted to make is, again, that the tax and tax justice has more of a role, and we're keen, and I think it's important in this session that we are talking about revenue and the point that there is enough revenue to go around. But it also has a different role and multiple roles, which again, others have talked about while it raises sustainable revenue for public service budgets, it also helps to redistribute both horizontal, vertical inequalities, and can do that by different forms of taxes, like wealth taxes, which have been mentioned, capital gains taxes, inheritance taxes, land value taxes. All these things will help towards redistribution and can feed through into revenue budgets as well. We talk about sometimes the repricing of market bads, such as carbon. Sometimes that's not a good illustration, but it's thought about in terms of alongside social protections. Strong social protections can be very progressive. And then the final one that I wanted to just very quickly mention, that has real resonance with the right to education, and certainly with gender equality and issues of austerity, is that there's quite a lot of research that suggests that the correlation between revenue that's raised by a state from tax and revenue that's from non-tax sources is quite different, and the revenue that comes from sustainable taxation increases and strengthens representation, which is what I'm talking about, the social contract. So it's kind of very important in that sense. I wanted to also just kind of turn to the revenue part of it, and two studies or two pieces of research we've done. One around something called the State of Tax Justice Report, which looks at two things. It looks at the tax abuse, direct tax abuse by multinational companies, and using figures from 2018, which from the OECD, there was 312 billion lost in tax by profit shifting from multinational companies moving their profits around to low or no tax tax havens and jurisdictions. So 312 billion in tax, quite significant. And going back, I think, to both Oria's point and others have made, there is the revenue to fund this. Now, and really worth mentioning as well that we're talking about estimates here. We're talking about conservative estimates, and we're talking about direct tax losses, not the sort of tax incentives and credits and all sorts of kind of tax gizmos that are available to multinational companies. The second element on this slide, which I hope you're still seeing on the left-hand side, is the revenue, the 171 billion that's lost to offshore tax evasion, to wealthy elites. And this kind of brings us back as well, I think, to the point about representation now, and the policies, the austerity that many countries have to bear, the the debt burdens that they have to bear are directly connected to the wealthy elites and how they're untaxed. They are able to influence policy, determine whether how much, in a sense, how much goes into which public services or doesn't go into that. I think we shouldn't underestimate the influence of wealthy elites in terms of determining kind of public discourse and how policies are determined. So the next thing I just wanted to briefly show you was a piece of research we did as part of the Tax Debt Alliance with something called the GRADE project. And that is the kind of government revenue and development estimates project. What we did in that project is looked at 63 different low income and middle income countries and assessed at what was the level of revenue forgone from those countries. And at the same time, we looked at the amount of children who are out of school, both boys and girls who are out of school in those 63 countries, who could be in school if we use 20% of the revenue that was being lost, only 20%, into the public revenue budgets and the education budgets. I don't know how well the table that I've got in front of you you can see, but it's showing that there are like over 41 million boys and girls out of primary school, and with the funding that's available from tax abuse, just using 20% of that, over 20 million children could be in school. So it's very significant that we actually get very granular around the budgets. And here's is at a glance which we can share with you at point, which just kind of explains how that particular piece works in terms of revenue. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for a moment so I can just move back to a couple of points that I wanted to finish off with. I think one of the things that others have mentioned, which I think is really worth reiterating, is that, and when we were talking about trillions of dollars, or certainly $500 billion of revenue that's lost each year in cross-border abuse by multinational companies and wealthy individuals, and that, with huge incentives for those actors to continue that or not to break that pattern of behavior. And the culprits doing that, shall we say, are big four accounting firms, international law firms, tax advisors, banks, and not only do they, which is really important as well, is not only do they advise to and use their technical ability to get around and circumvent some of the rules, they bring together sort of intensive lobbying power, so that both the legal space and something I was trying to say before, and the social permission to continue to undermine states and undermine societies continues. So what did I, maybe just to finish off, because I'm kind of feeling like a little bit that I could just start repeating what others have said, and which might not be best use of time. To finish off, maybe I can just spend 2 minutes, Maria, on some of the important policy solutions, and also which include the UN Tax Convention that Evelyn talked about in detail. For a long time, we've talked about the something called the ABC of tax transparency, and it certainly is. We think necessary that progress rests on the normalization of that tax justice agenda for not just for the right to education and for gender equality, but it's significant that the fact that the obstacles are put in front of transparency and accountability, are put in front of automatic exchange of tax information between jurisdictions. The fact that obstacles are put in front of the establishment of beneficial ownership registers of companies and trusts and foundations, the fact that, you know, the European Court of Justice was able to provide a ruling to say that the beneficial ownership registry was unlawful. Those sort of obstacles continue to mean that while there are gaps, while there is but partial automatic information exchange, while there's partial beneficial ownership of who owns companies, and while multinationals do not have to publicly report their country by country reports of where do they make their economic activity and where do they tax that economic activity, while it continues to be partial and not transparent, when it continues to be opaque, if you like, the loss of, and to use an expression that was coined and has been used as a campaign in the African region by colleagues at TJ in Africa, that bleeding of revenue will continue. So what's important is, my kind of final point really, is who makes the rules and who enforces that, the rules. At the moment, it's the OECD who both designs those rules and enforces those rules. In reality, it's a small group of countries, and a wealthy group of countries. So our proposal within the tax justice movement is that the global governance needs to change, and for the 21st century needs to be inclusive, needs to be representative, and we would say needs to be in a truly kind of intergovernmental framework which has equity within it. And I think these transparency and governance measures should and can reset the platform in which gender equality is strengthened through the access of public services like public access to education. The last point to say perhaps is this year is a really critical year for that process, and Evelyn mapped that out for us. In the next 2 to 3 months within the Latin American region, the work around a UN tax convention has been very much the African region and African finance ministers have shown incredible leadership in moving the governance of or questioning and challenging the governance of international tax rules. The Latin American jurisdictions and finance ministers are about to embark on that same journey. And I'd ask people who are thinking about these issues and thinking about the right to education for women and girls, about gender equality, the access of education for women and girls, that it's really important that we connect these international governance issues with what is happening at a national level and the revenues that we're raising at a national level, and how that over time influences not just tax policies, but influence public service policies and public service spending. I'll finish there.
Thank you.
Maria.
That's great. Thank you very much, Liz. That's really, really good. And also thank you for all the amazing work that the Tax Justice Network does, because particularly in terms of the data that you offer, like that, getting those estimates, considering how difficult it is and how secretive everything is, how difficult it is to get those estimates of the amount of revenue that is being lost, because as you said, without automatic exchange of information, beneficial ownership, country by country reporting, we cannot really get that. So we are only looking at the top of the iceberg of how much money is actually being lost, is being transferred, and this is money that is not being used for gender transformative public services. So I'm next, and I'm going to be presenting on what's the relation between tax justice and education financing. Most of you have already covered this, so I'm going to go fairly quickly through some of them. So as Farida already mentioned, and David as well, in 2015, the governments committed to delivering equitable, inclusive, and quality education for all by 2030. Well, let me tell you, things are not looking great right now. We are experiencing the effects of a chronic underfunding of education as well as other public services. The public sector wage bill caps that Rose, David, and Farida already mentioned are actually increasing the estimated 69 million teachers, which is the very conservative estimate of the teacher shortage worldwide. We will be having a new estimate very soon, like at the end of the year. And my take is that it will be much higher than this. As we know, the domestic resource mobilization that Evelyn, David, again, we have been mentioning that it's so necessary, and it should be making 97% of the total education financing, is decreasing and is really being deprioritized, and this 3% keeps taking all the spotlight. And this is wrong, because as again Farida mentioned, this is influencing the policies, and these policies are being made through, like, behind closed doors, and this is actually breaking this social contract, this representation that Liz was talking about as one of the 4 R's, right? So this is very important that this is shifted, and this is one of the calls for the Global Action Week for Education, which will be taking place in May this year from the Global Campaign for Education, which is about decolonizing education financing. It is very important that DRM is actually prioritized, and this is done in a sustainable way. I'm not going to talk again about the debt crisis, because I think that my colleague Ross has already covered it, but just basically saying that when public services are not being properly financed, this is actually resulting in either the lack of availability, so completely this is leading to violation of the right to education, people cannot access education, or the education is becoming a commodity, and this is being privatized, so only those who can afford it can access it. And again, like, if it is depending on how much people can pay, this is leading to a stratification. So we are seeing the low fee private schools, and I always say low fee private schools because it might look low for us, but not for the people who are already living in poverty. Again, this is leading to cost sharing strategies, even when education is public and is supposed to be completely for free, but they are asking for a lot of fees, and we have done already some research about it. Again, we see that those that bear the negative impact tend to be girls more than boys, and normally within the households, we see that those that are prioritized are the firstborn male without disabilities. So again, this is furthering social inequalities and gender inequalities. And also, when some people talk about harnessing the household contributions to education, it really makes me angry, because this is the most regressive way of funding education, and it has really dark consequences, like gender consequences and social consequences. So I really don't want anyone to be like talking about this anymore, please, particularly not the IMF or the World Bank, because they are setting the rules, as we saw, top down. And we saw that the management of the COVID pandemic was really bad in terms of like what it meant in terms of the GDP that it has decreased. Also, some other sectors have been prioritized. Education was deprioritized, and girls and women suffer a lot more, as we saw, particularly now through the austerity and fiscal consolidation policies. But things are not looking great because we know now that the war in Ukraine, the inflation, and also the climate crisis is also affecting negatively to the education financing. So, sorry, so it's not good. Okay. So what we need to do is to be looking and increasing the 4 S's of the budget. So these are the share, the size, sensitivity, and scrutiny, right? So I'm going to be talking about the share of education, although I would say that we, for far too long, we have been concentrating on the share of education, right? But we see that the share has been decreasing since COVID. Only in some regions, such as Sub-Saharan Africa and Middle East and North Africa, has marginally increased. But in the rest of the regions, the share of the national budget allocated to education has decreased and is far from reaching the recommended 20%. Right? And it is the same in terms of the GDP, which is supposed to be between 4 and 6%, and the 6% is for low and middle income countries. But even for those countries that have managed to reach the 20% of the national budget dedicated to education, very often they find that they don't have enough. And why is that? That's because at the end of the day, the size of the pie is not big enough. We see that in many countries, particularly in Africa, we see that the tax to GDP isn't enough. Like Thomas Piketty, the French economist, talk about those states that don't reach the 20% of the tax to GDP only being able to perform regalian functions and not being able to provide good quality public services. Well, we see that Africa, that most countries are actually increasing this tax to GDP, but this is going way too slowly. As we can see in 2021, the average is 16% in Africa, and this hides some huge inequalities between countries, right? And this is not to say that this is actually being redistributive, right? Because it also depends on how we increase the GDP. Without repeating much of what has been covered before, obviously we know that there are progressive and there are regressive taxes. Regressive taxes normally they tend to be the indirect taxes such as value-added taxes and sales taxes. Progressive taxes tend to be normally more direct taxes such as personal income tax and corporate income tax. And we know that normally poorer countries tend to rely on regressive taxation on VAT a lot more than they rely on progressive taxes. I haven't mentioned wealth taxes, which is the theme for this year for the Global Days of Action in Tax. But wealth taxes are one of the most progressive taxes that we can find. However, they are very difficult to implement. They are progressive because they reduce already the inequality and also because it's a really good way to raise revenue. And I'm just going to show you very quickly what I presented just before in another presentation. I'm just going to quote Thomas Piketty, who says that in an economy where the rate of return of capital investment exceeds the rate of growth, inherited wealth will always grow faster than earned wealth, thus making increasing inequality inevitable. Wealth will concentrate to levels incompatible with democracy, let alone social justice. And we can see that the levels of inequality are just rising nearly exponentially, with the 1% of the population accumulating most of the wealth, as you can see here, in comparison to the 99%, right? That only has 37%. Sorry for just changing from one slide to another, but I thought that it is important to show that the current state of affairs is actually designing these levels of massive inequalities because it is taxing labor rather than taxing wealth or capital, and this really needs to change, right? Because we need to tax progressively, we need tax justice. So just to say that according to the Oxfam research, a tax of up to 5% of the world's multimillionaires and billionaires could raise $1.7 trillion a year. That's a lot of money that would definitely cover education, financing, and other public services, health, water and sanitation, etc. So how do we actually increase the size in a sustainable and progressive way? well, not only through wealth taxes, but we also need to stop giving away these harmful tax incentives that that some of my colleagues have already mentioned, Evelyn, Aurea, as well as Liz, right? We have done a lot of research also in ActionAid with like calculating how much they are giving away per country and how much 20% of that could cover in terms of education outputs. Countries also need to renegotiate tax treaties that they are sometimes they have this colonial colonial legacy, and they are really like so negative for the countries from the global south. We really need to tackle tax avoidance as well as tax evasion. I'm not going to go into the differences, but one of avoidance is it's legal but morally wrong. Evasion is illegal, but there are a lot of blurry lines as well. The $483 billion estimated to be the tax revenue lost that that Liz has already mentioned, and just to show that this is not that the tax havens are not in Caribbean islands, right? Most of them are the countries, like the big countries that we know, and because they are enabling these vulnerabilities and they are making it possible to that countries, like poor countries, are not even able to have enough resources to finance good quality public services. Well, we have already covered the share and the size. It's very important to be looking at the sensitivity of the allocation, because we know that most of the education budget actually is actually being enjoyed by those who have the most, right? Because when we put a lot of money into, let's say, tertiary education, we see that only those who normally come from middle and high income households actually go through all the levels of education. So for them to be there, like, you know, we are leaving behind most of the people in low income households, in the lowest percentage of the population. In that sense, but it also has a massive like gender impact in this sense, because we see that for every dollar that we spend on education, even in primary, if it is the same already in secondary, like boys profit a lot more, and each boy gets like 1.4, right? Because already some of the girls are leaving education, right, at secondary, and we see it's the same at tertiary education. So we really need to have an intersectional analysis of the spending to show how this gets, how education is actually bringing enjoy in that sense, right? Like to avoid discrimination in education, and to ensure that that the spending, the allocation has an equity criteria. But something that I haven't included as a slide in itself is the scrutiny. And this is crucial, because we really need to increase participation, transparency, and accountability in terms of the education financing. And this needs to be done to include all the stakeholders into all the budget processing, to make it more participatory, to ensure that the money is allocated and it is received timely and it's spent as it should be, right? So for that, we need to create a capacity to develop the capacity, not only at the top levels, but also at community level, at local level, to ensure that the education budget actually works in practice as well. So I don't want to take more of your time, but I just wanted to say thank you very much. And we also have some of the cartoons, and I will be sharing some of the links in the chat of some of the words, so you can read more about it. So let me just stop sharing. So hopefully I can see you all. And I just wanted to say thank you very much also to all the panelists. I don't know how we are doing for time and whether we have some questions in the Q&A. Let me just very quickly, I can already see the questions. Yeah, we will be sharing the video has been recorded and it will be posted on YouTube. So hopefully you will be able to see it. I would like you I would like to invite you to follow us in Twitter, where we will be posting all of it. Our Twitter handle will be shared very briefly by Lais, who has access to our to the chat. Sorry, I didn't get access to the chat. I know that we have interpretation for this meeting, so I don't want to take more time from all the interpreters, but if we can just switch the cameras on, that would be really good. And I know that the UN Special Rapporteur for the Right to Education, Farida, had to leave because he had a previous commitment, but she also wanted to thank you all for all your time and attention. So I don't know whether we can all switch the cameras on. Very good. So I cannot see any questions or comments. I know that some people were having some problems to access the chat. But now this is the time, if anyone has any like burning comment, like now that we have gone through all the presenters, anyone, like if you want to do a quick, like 1 minute, wrap up, like some of the thoughts, if it might have provoked you. I'm not going to be naming you, but you want to do it, now this is the time. Otherwise, I could see a hand up, like from Caroline from the beginning. I don't know whether she had a question. Lais, I don't know whether you can allow a participant to ask a question.
Let me check. I think I can allow her to talk. Hello, Carol. Can you hear?
Yes, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Sorry, my hand was put up accidentally, but I do think this is wonderful work and really appreciate all of your inputs. One thing to think about is many teachers around the world are actually protesting austerity measures and trying to take these issues in hand. And I think to highlight some of those struggles and align with them and provide more. This is such rich and deep and wonderful information. And I could see placards and lots of campaigns being built with teacher unions. And I know you've talked to them for this research, but I think also highlighting that these messages are carrying through and would be wonderful to be building those campaigns with teachers as they are aligning with other public sector workers around these very specific issues. I'm working on some similar issues, so I'll be in touch with all of you because I'd love to kind of think through some of these questions and the data for sure. So thank you, that was brilliant.
Thank you very much, Caroline. And yeah, Antonia Wolf from Education International was going to be one of our panelists, but she had to drop today for an emergency, so she wasn't able to join us. But obviously, she is also, like, Education International is part of the TaxAid Alliance that brings together ActionAid, Global Alliance for Tax Justice Network, Education International, the Global Campaign for Education. And Rose was trying to share some of the work that they have done together. I don't know, Rose, whether you would like to share in 1 minute some of the work that we have been doing with them as well.
Sure, happy to just add a really brief comment on that. I didn't stress particularly well the basis for the different research because we're talking to multiple pieces of research, but in 10 countries together with PSI and Education International. We've worked together with unions on a national level to challenge these. So it's very intertwined and sorry if it seemed to come across quite top line. One of the examples I can share is, for example, in Zimbabwe, where workers have challenged the poverty wages that are below the bread basket, but so far that not to success, and we're seeing many teachers actually leaving the sector in Zimbabwe and moving to countries across the border. So I think it's also important to note that this is obviously a global issue where underinvestment in countries in the global north leads to extraction of workers educated in the global south, not just in education, but also in health. For example, in the UK, the National Health Service, the majority of the workers are actually not educated within the UK, and in the Netherlands as well. There aren't enough doctors and nurses trained to actually fulfill the health need on that level. So there's many global dimensions to this, and Public Services International and Education International work both supporting on a local and national level, but also bringing those struggles together as those impacts perpetuate across. And I think it's really important that governments understand that with the finance and economic decisions they're making, the least they should do is not harm the SDGs and women's rights. As many colleagues have already pointed to gender responsive budgeting and impact assessments, etc. Thanks.
That's great. Well, we really are out of time and I'm feeling really bad for the interpreters as well. So if you don't mind, I will be closing now this webinar. Thank you very much, everyone, for your great contributions. And thank you very much to the audience for being there. And for those who will be watching us, will be watching the recording. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks, Maria. Thank you, everyone.